Hello. Welcome to Grief is Real, Big, Better Shared, the podcast everyone needs to hear, but nobody wants to hear. Grief. What is grief? What helps us feel better when we are grieving? These are some of the questions we hear a lot. I'm Angela Hamblin-Kelly, the Executive Director of the Baptist Centers for Good Grief, and I'm joined today with three of my incredible colleagues to talk about grief and coping. A little backstory here first. Our grief program started in 1999, so for 24-ish years, we have been providing grief camps, grief groups, and individual grief counseling for children, teens, and adults. We're doing this podcast because clients have been asking for it as a platform for support. That's really the foundation of all of our services, our community asking for more. And we're so grateful to our community donors who have generously supported us over the years, as all of our services are free of charge. So for these 24 years, we've grown from a children's grief camp to a program with 3 grief centers that provide grief support to Tennessee, Mississippi, Arkansas, and Southeast Missouri. So why have so many people asked for this podcast? Mainly because grief is the most universal experience there is. And again, this is the podcast everyone needs to hear because grief involves pain and vulnerability, which is also why this is the podcast nobody wants to hear. So I sit here today with 24 plus years experience as a grief counselor, but I'm also a griever. I've lost my dad, my brother, and my nephew, along with several other beloved family members over an 8-year time period. So in our podcast, we hope to honestly look at grief and discuss the heart and head tug of war from an evidence-based grief counseling perspective, but also from the real life perspective too. Our plan is for episodes to be candid and honest discussions with grievers. But like I said earlier, today we want to start with a real and open talk about what grief actually is. So first, let's meet these incredible colleagues of mine who are here with me today so we can really process grief and the healing we know that happens and the healing that we have seen in so much of our work.
My name is Barbara. I'm a licensed clinical social worker. I have been at the center for the past 12 years as a grief counselor. A lot of times people ask us why we choose to do this work. I can honestly say of all the social work jobs I've held during my professional career, being a grief counselor has been one of the most rewarding. Being able to witness grievers move from a place of pain and despair to a place of hope is so fulfilling.
And my name's Carolyn. I'm a counselor at the center, and I have been there in various capacities for about 20 years. I started out as a volunteer for our camps and loved it so much that eventually came on as an employee. And I get asked a lot why we do this work, and I think so much of it is because grief is the flip side of love, and so we hear love stories all day, and so it's a beautiful thing to witness other people's love stories, even in the midst of their pain.
Hi, my name is Lauren Strini. I'm the clinical director at the Baptist Centers for Good Grief. I've been working at the center for 10 years. I've been working as a counselor for 15. And prior to coming on staff, I also was a volunteer and with our camp program and just loved this work and was so excited at the opportunity to come on board as a staff member full time. And I think I would just echo what both Barbara and Carolyn said, that, doing this work is rewarding in the sense that we are able to witness healing. We have the privilege and what we consider to be an honor of being able to start with people when they are in a place of where it just feels very dark for them. And we're able to walk with them on that journey and see that healing and see them start to be able to connect with life again and to not just survive, but to live fully and to thrive. And in the process, they share great love with us. They share those love stories that Carolyn mentioned, and that is just so great to see and to witness. And so that's why we do what we do.
And I'm thrilled to sit down here with you all today and to have this conversation. Some people might think, a grief podcast, why? Why are you doing that? That sounds awful. But just like we said, this is the podcast everyone needs to hear, but nobody wants to hear. And so keeping in line with that, let's just jump in. Barbara, let's talk about grief and what it is and how you describe grief to someone.
Well, I usually describe grief as all the thoughts and feelings that you have running throughout your body after someone you love dies. And of course, there's many different types of grief in the world. I mean, I think of divorce or job loss, but our focus is on grief related to death. Many times I describe grief to clients as being like your thumbprint. No two people experience grief in the same way. Each person's grief is unique to them. It can be quite a complex experience. It's sort of like peeling away the layers of an onion. Early on, you don't even know how many layers there are.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think a lot of people come to us at the centers asking a lot about kind of the stages of grief. That's something that so many people have been taught throughout their life. There are these stages and we have to follow those. And, actually those stages were written more for the person who was actually dying instead of the person grieving that person's death. And so that's a misconception that a lot of people have. I mean, we all wish there was a checklist to feel better, but sadly there's not one out there. But I thought we'd stop for a moment and let's talk about what we know to be true. And this is probably like the most educational part of this podcast because we really want it to be conversationally. But I think we have to stop and really look at some of these things we know to be true. And you said it, Barbara. Grief is an individual experience, but we do grieve in 5 ways. So that's about as close to a checklist as you're going to get out of us, is that there are these 5 ways, these common reactions we have. So y'all hang in here with me for a minute and let's just talk about this because I think this really needs to be laid out for folks. So we grieve physically. So our body grieves. So that might be headaches, muscle tension, upset stomach. We could talk for hours about just how we physically grieve. We grieve cognitively. That's our mind, our thoughts. So that might be forgetfulness, difficulty concentrating. We grieve emotionally. I think we all know that's the one everyone knows, sad, right? Grief equals sad. But what about those other feelings of anger and regret and even relief? We grieve behaviorally. That may be a loss of interest in things that you once enjoyed, or maybe your alcohol intake has increased. We grieve spiritually. Those are those why questions. Maybe even questioning our beliefs or having a strengthening of our faith. So grief is not just sad or crying. It is that full body experience. And grief doesn't happen all nice and orderly. Grief comes in waves, just like the ocean. That's how I look at it, as the ocean. That really speaks to me. Some waves are so predictable, like you can see it and we have time to prepare for them. And those are the waves like holidays. Like we see them on the calendar. We know they're approaching and we have time to make a plan. While other times a wave can just surprise us with intensity and almost just, knock us over. That can be like being in a store and hearing a song over the sound system. That certainly happened to me once. And I had to fully abandon the cart and everything and leave just because I was so overcome with emotion. And so grief is messy. You said that, Barbara. It's unpredictable and very unique to each person. And it's a lot. So that was a lot. Thanks for hanging in there with me with that. But I think we just really needed to kind of lay that out for our listeners. So Carolyn, talking about that, let's talk about what people's early thoughts are of their grief or what their expectations might be. Like, how do you see that in your work?
Well, I think when clients first come to us, they are thinking about timelines. They are thinking about how long is this going to last? How long do I have to feel this kind of pain? And they're looking for that checklist you talked about. They're thinking, what are the steps? I need you to tell me the steps of what I can do to get past this. And then, of course, we have to tell them that grief isn't something we get over. It's something we learn to live with and move forward and take with us and incorporate into our lives. And so I think it's difficult because many times their time frames are either because of what other people have told them, going through all the firsts. That's a common thing you hear people say, I need to make it through all the firsts and then it's going to magically be over. And then also they do think that because other people have moved on and aren't talking about their grief with them and they're grieving in isolation, they think something's wrong with them because they are still grieving. And so many times those expectations that they have bring about a lot of shame, I think, for them and a lot of guilt and isolation because, again, they don't want to talk about it because nobody else is, so they're getting the cue that they should not be.
Yeah, I was just going to say, Carolyn, that I found that so true about people wanting the checklist, because I remember this gentleman once, you know how we say every death needs 100 tellings, and he told me he was at 81. So thinking that if he got to 100, he would be done.
And so I think, too, sometimes people get these messages that if I just don't think about it, if I just avoid my grief, if I just stay busy, if I don't go there, then it'll get better, because in those moments, they appear to be doing better. They appear to be, happy and functioning and doing everything that they're supposed to. And I think there is benefit to that sometimes. We have to be able to take a break from our grief sometimes. But I think that if we do that all the time, then what happens is we start pushing that grief back, and we're avoiding it. We're pushing it away, putting it on the shelf. And what we know is that eventually we have to allow ourselves to pick up that grief and feel it and process it and talk about it. And, that that's not the goal, is to just stay busy all the time.
And I think along with that, Lauren, I'll hear that's just if time passes, if time passes, that it's just going to automatically be better. And many times I tell clients it's not about just time passing, it's about what happens in that time.
So speaking of like time passing and stages of grief and checklist and all those things, another thing that people want to know about is the time passing. So, how does grief show up for people in the beginning versus maybe a year later, 3 years later, 5 years later, and the fact that it is going to continue to show up. So,
well, I had a client, and she described her grief as being like the ticker tape that you see at the bottom of the TV screen when a storm is approaching or when there's election results. And for her, the tape said, "My child is dead. My child is dead." And it ran constantly. And early on in her grief, she was almost completely focused on that ticker tape and that message that her child was dead. But as she began to heal, she found she was able to focus more on her life. However, the tape, it continued to run. And she found that on anniversaries or birthdays or just random hard days, that her focus would again go to the ticker tape. So I just thought it was a very unique way of expressing how, you just never get over your grief, but you learn to live with it.
That's a great example, because it does. That is what people hear over and over in their head is my child died, or my husband died, and nobody else seems to be maybe hearing it quite the same. So what's it like for people maybe a few months in?
Well, I think at first, a lot of times, people are in shock, right? It's almost like there's a blanket of numbness that's kind of wrapped around them. And I think that serves a function. It helps them be able to get through those first days and weeks when there's so much that they have to take care of and so much that they have to do. And just knowing that if they were to feel the full impact of everything all at once, it would just be overwhelming. And so then what we find is after those first few weeks, when things start settling down, people around them start going back to their normal routines, that a lot of times that's when they really start to feel it on a deeper level. And a lot of times that's the point when they reach out to our center, because that shock starts to wear off little by little, and they start to really feel their grief more intensely.
I think that's so true, Lauren, because I think sometimes people come to us and they think, well, it's been 3, it's been 4, it's been 5 months. I should be feeling better, and I'm feeling worse. So what's going on?
Right.
Absolutely. And then a year in, what's that like?
Yeah, and then like you said, Barbara, they do. They think, okay, it's been a year. I've been through all the firsts. Many times clients will come in thinking there's some magic to a year. It's like, after that year anniversary, they come in and they're like, whew, I made it through that year. And then sometimes they're very surprised when 14 months in, they're feeling worse maybe. And because they're starting another year and realizing, okay, this is forever. This is how it's going to be always. And so that realization of the permanence of it, and sometimes can hit really hard in that second, that year point and that first few months after that year.
And I just think that goes to show how you need that support, not just in the early months, but going way into the second year, third year, that's so important.
And that you need that education piece. I mean, this isn't a shameless plug for the podcast by any means, but we need to learn about grief, and we need to know about grief, and that 5, 6, 15 months later, it's not abnormal that you're feeling your grief. Like, that is so normal, but that is not the message that our world and our culture puts out to others. And so, Carolyn, you kind of alluded to this, but even after a year, people, will struggle or be really hard on themselves that they're grieving. So 2 years in and later, Barbara, how do you see that?
Well, I think, it with time and with intentionally going to your grief, you do see that there is some lightening of the pain, but it doesn't mean that it always goes away, because you think about, you always have that relationship with that person. They're always going to be part of your life and loved. So, of course, you're going to have times where, you will still feel the pain.
And I think that very much coincides, like you mentioned before, when you're talking about the ticker tape, with what else is going on in your life. If there's holidays, significant days, certain seasons, or if you experience additional losses in whatever capacity, that can bring up your grief again.
And when people hit specific milestones, many times if it's a first day of school, a child's graduation, a wedding, or significant things in your life, many years later, people can experience their grief more intensely as they're going through something like that.
And that kind of goes back to what we were talking about, grief being like the ocean, those waves. So some of those waves that you all just mentioned, maybe graduations or special days, are those waves that we can see and that we can predict. But goodness, it's also those small waves that we can't predict. It's the hearing a song, or seeing something at a store, or maybe someone talking about a trip that they've gone on, and it just brings all of that back. And I think that those little waves are the ones that can be so crushing sometimes to people too, because they come out of the blue. And sometimes people have that pressure of, well, it's been 2 years. Why is that sadness still here? And I don't want that to be a downer part of this podcast by any means, but I think people need to know that we grieve as long as we love.
Yes, along those lines of feeling it at certain times that just come out of the blue. My own father has been dead for 26 years now, and I feel like I've grieved that healthily over the years. But then this last year, my father-in-law was actually ill and was in the hospital. Happened to be Father's Day, which happens to be the last day I was with my dad in the hospital when he died. And here I am in the hospital again on a Father's Day, 26 years later, holding my father-in-law's hand, just like I was holding my dad's hand. And the waves of emotion that came, that just out of nowhere, I did not expect 26 years later, just because of that significance of that and experiencing that again. But does that mean I was not grieving healthy, or I had not addressed my grief? No, it just means we, as Barbara said, we're going to love these people for our lifetime. And so we're going to grieve them for our lifetime.
And it just goes back to say what we even call this podcast, grief is real. Grief is so real. And it is also so big in the fact that 26 years later, you still feel the love. It's the grief, but it's also the love. So thank you for sharing that, Carolyn. So also one thing that people talk about a lot is what's normal, like what is normal now that everything around me is abnormal. So, one thing we'll hear is, my world has been shattered, but everyone else is just moving on. Everyone's just acting normal, and the world is moving forward, and I can't even put one foot in front of the other.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think a lot of clients, as Lauren mentioned earlier, they come into the center at that point, maybe when people start pulling away. Remember, the casseroles have quit coming, the cards have quit showing up, the texts and the phone calls are getting fewer and far between, and they're not feeling supported as much, and because the rest of the world has gone on. Now, does it mean that those other people are not supporting them or thinking about them? No, but their lives have not been changed in the way that the griever that we're seeing has been changed. And it's those little moments of every single day that are different. And so meanwhile, that person is grieving in isolation, and then yet their friend might be talking to them about, the new house they're building, or something that they're upset that the kids did. And meanwhile, they're grieving their child, or they're grieving their parent or their husband. And it just feels as if they're living in a world that they don't fit in. And so many times that small talk and those things that are priorities to others at that point, that doesn't feel normal because that's not their reality at that time.
I remember, just to share a story also, when my father died, I had to go to the grocery store the next day. And we had to have some essential things. And I was checking out. I just wanted out of there so fast. And I remember the lady just being so nice and so friendly, which is her job, said, "Have a great day." And I just stood there staring at her like, how dare you say that? How could you say that? How can I have a great day? Don't you know what's going on? And I'd been a grief counselor at that point for about 12 years. So it was a very eye-opening experience for me to be standing there as the professional person, but also now as this true griever, trying to figure out, how am I going to live in this world where people are having good days?
Grief comes up a lot at the grocery store, doesn't it?
I think it does.
Yes.
It really does. And I've had numerous clients say that at the grocery store and when they're driving alone in their cars are some of the triggers that the emotions really come to the surface.
I think it's a lot of those normal everyday things that we do. And then now nothing is normal and everyday. And you guys know that's something we talk about all the time, is this concept of new normal. You can't be who you were before the death.
And then I think you still have people all the time asking, how are you doing?
Right.
And I think the number one question people, grievers, say that they hate to get is that question, how are you doing? Because sometimes they want to say, do you really want to know how I'm doing? Yes. But a lot of times they just say, I'm fine, and move on.
Right. Because that's the easy thing to say. Yeah. And that's what they feel like people want to hear. Mm-hmm. Well, Angela, you had mentioned the new normal. And, I think when we think about grief and that process, it truly is a process. It is a learning process. Essentially, you are learning how to continue to live your life and figuring out what that looks like for you now, and living your life in a way where your grief is always a part of it and your loved one who died is always a part of it, but knowing that it looks very different from what it looked like before. And so there's a lot of, I think, trial and error with that as far as, figuring out what feels right, what feels normal. And of course, that word normal is a very relative term in this situation because nothing feels normal, as you said before. Everything feels like it's just been turned upside down, like the rug's been pulled out from under you. And I was actually leading a support group several years back. This topic of new normal came up. And I remember the people in that group became very angry at the idea of a new normal. They did not like that phrase. They did not like that word because nothing about the way they were living now felt normal. And I think that's true for a lot of grieving people. And I think essentially that's because this new place that you are in, you did not ask to be here. You did not choose this. And so you are left having to pick up the pieces and figure out what it's going to look like now. And that was not anything that you would have ever asked for. You liked the normal that was there before.
And along those same lines, Lauren, I've heard people say they don't like the new normal term. They like new reality because, like you said, there is nothing normal about where they are now.
Right. I think they also feel a lot of pressure to figure out what that new normal is. Mm-hmm. Like, I've got to figure out what my life is now that this person is gone. And I'm always telling clients, it takes a while to find this. It took a while to build the life that you had before. And it's going to take a while to figure out what that life is moving forward. So giving yourself time to do that and patience.
Absolutely. Giving yourself permission not to have it all figured out right away.
Exactly.
Y'all are bringing up that really good part about grief, too, that I don't think we've given enough attention to, which is anger and protest. Because most of us have been raised that anger is a bad emotion and you're not supposed to be angry and you're certainly not supposed to show anger and you're not supposed to show any type of protest either. But my goodness, nobody asked for this. You said that, Lauren. If we even take the word bereaved and we break it down to what the true meaning of that word is, it's to be robbed. Well, of course we're going to be angry. Of course we're going to protest. We didn't ask for this. We didn't want this. It's happened, and now I have to have a new normal, a new reality. So yeah, I mean, I think all of our clients have gotten mad at us and protested us at using that language. But that goes to that real part of grief of protesting and anger. And those are real emotions and feelings. And so I'm just curious, how do you see that showing up with clients, especially in a culture where it's not okay?
I think sometimes it just shows up as irritability.
Oh,
They don't have the
absolutely.
words to say that they're angry, but they're just irritable. Little things just really bother them that maybe they didn't even notice before.
I think so. And I also think that the feeling of anger is also one that, whether in the context of grief or not, is sometimes felt to be a bad feeling, the one that we're not allowed to feel. And a lot of times I think that's because of behaviors that get associated with anger. And I think it's so important to know that there's a very significant distinction between the feelings and the behaviors. And it's okay to feel angry. Of course you feel angry. It's a natural emotion and a natural reaction to loss.
And on the flip side, some people tell me, well, I've never felt the anger. Is something wrong with me because I don't feel the anger? And I think that just goes back to what you were saying, Angela, about everybody's grief's unique.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you were talking about earlier about people trying to answer that question, how are you? I think we could probably all do a whole podcast on how we've helped people answer that question. But I was just thinking about a client I had once who really struggled with anger and just so deeply rooted in his grief. And we were trying to come up with some various answers for how are you? And he said, well, I really just want to tell people I'm angry. But he knew because of his physical stature and stuff. He said, but I think I should end it with, but I won't hit you. And I was just so proud because he was trying to really be honest with people. But he also knew, like, I'm not angry at you. I'm not going to take it out on you. But I am angry and I need to be heard. I'm angry. So we've talked a lot about grief and what it is and how it shows up for so many different types of grievers. So let's talk about what really helps grieving people.
Well, I think we all have developed ways of coping over time to stress or hard things. And sometimes they're healthy and sometimes they're unhealthy. But since you've never had to grieve the loss of this person, it's a process of learning what helps and what doesn't help. And I just like the analogy of the toolbox, that not every tool is going to work for every situation. And sometimes you might need alone time just to reflect, and other times you might need to be surrounded by friends and family. And you might find that you don't have all the tools in the toolbox that you need, and you have to come up with some new ways of coping. And it could be things like journaling or attending a support group or just asking for help. And I think the thing to remember is that you just really have to be patient with yourself because you've never done this before.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I feel like clients kind of look for this one big thing that's going to help them with their grief journey. And I always tell them it's not about one thing. It's little and often. So it's doing little things often. It's making those little things part of your day. And I said it's very much, mental health is very much like physical health. Physical health, we can't just eat broccoli and we're healthy. We eat broccoli every day and we're healthy. How it would be so nice if it was that simple.
Amen.
But what we have to do is we have to exercise and we have to eat right and we have to get sleep and de-stress. And it's the same thing with our mental health. We have to find good coping skills, good ways of self-care, good ways of expression, good means of support. And it's taking all those little things and stringing them together to provide mental health and to make our grief journey more manageable.
And I like to tell people, too, is if you try one thing and it doesn't work for you, go to something else. Try something else.
I think another big piece of coping is expression, really allowing yourself to spend time with your grief, feel it, process it, and doing it in a way where you're showing it outside of yourself in some way. I think that is so healing. And whether that's, talking about it with supportive people, whether that's writing about it, whether that's, using some sort of artistic form of expression or some sort of physical movement, there's endless possibilities for how you can spend time with your grief and how you can express it. But I think there's just so much benefit in just that process of expression. Even though we know that there's nothing that anybody's going to be able to say in response that's going to fix it or take it away. Probably some of our friends and family members would really like to be able to do that. They would love to be able to have those magic words to cheer us up and make it better. And we know that those don't exist, but there is so much benefit in just the expression. And so for people who are supporting grieving people, I think that's important to keep in mind too, that giving them that space and just being present with them while they express whatever they need to is actually one of the most helpful things that you can do.
Mm-hmm. And I think we have to acknowledge that expression is not always a pretty, tidy, neat thing, like we said, like journaling, or some people will, kind of go into some other maybe craft kind of things, but sometimes it's rough and gruff and hard. And I have a client who got his axe and he chopped wood, and he chopped more wood, and he chopped more wood, and his daughter died, and that's what he did. And he needed to get to that point where he was struggling. He had his heart rate up so much that it was struggling to breathe, and really feeling all that muscle engagement and feeling his whole body engaged in that. I have a good friend who is actually a minister, and I think that makes the story even more fun, because when her husband died, she went to estate sales and bought dishes, and she threw those dishes and threw them and threw them. And she needed that physical release, and also hearing, kind of the breaking of that glass. And that's always stuck out with me, that was something that really, really worked for her. So I think that physical response sometimes is not always so pretty.
And just what you are saying makes me think of one of my favorite sayings, which is emotions need motion. And that's just what y'all are describing.
Absolutely, they do. And sometimes they need that quiet motion, maybe of reflection through, maybe even some yoga or deep breathing. We're all very big advocates of deep breathing exercises, but sometimes it needs that true, outward big motions. I know another person who really helped her with her grief through kickboxing, again, needing that physical outlet.
Absolutely. We grieve physically, right? That's one of the 5 ways that we grieve. And so coping with grief should include a physical component too.
So we just want to make sure our listeners know that it's not always pretty and neat and tidy, and it has to be whatever works for you. And something may work today and not work in 2 weeks. And so that's why you have that toolbox there that you can continue to pull different things out and try. But you have to pull them out and try them and practice.
You had asked about ways of coping with grief, and I think another really important way of coping with grief is through memorialization. Having ways of continuing to feel connected with your loved one who died, of actively and openly remembering them. And again, just like with expression, what that looks like can be, anything. You can be very creative with that. And it doesn't have to be, big formal events. Of course, we think of funerals and memorial services as a very ritualized form of memorialization, and one that's, kind of ingrained in our culture. But it doesn't have to be limited to that. It can be something just that you do on your own, something very simple and personal, like wearing something that belonged to your loved one, or keeping an item of theirs close by, or going to a special place, or doing a special activity. It could be something you do by yourself, or with friends, or with family, or with a big, large group. There's lots of different ways that you can actively remember somebody, but I think that that's so important to healing too. It ties into what we've said before about how you are continuing to live your life always loving that person. And so I think it's important to create space for that person in your life still.
We talk about when someone dies, we feel like we lose that relationship, but we lose that physical relationship, but it becomes one of memory. And I think, yes, is what you said, Lauren, it's so important to keep connecting in those ways and have other ways to connect to that person throughout your life.
And sometimes people say that, they find that people around them don't even want to say their loved one's name, or they don't want to share a memory because they're so afraid of making you sad, and just how important it is to say their name and to continue that relationship.
Yeah, I hear that so much from people, not necessarily our clients, but other people in my life. And they'll say, well, I hate to mention something because I don't want to make them sad. Like they're not thinking about it all the time and aren't sad. So, right. Yeah, I think it's important that people have that permission to talk about it. And like you said, just to say their name, because many times after those first few weeks, their name's never mentioned again by anyone else. And that's so hard for that person grieving.
Right. We were talking before about how you can feel kind of lonely in your grief and isolated when other people start to move on. And when they say their name, that shows the person who's grieving that they're still thinking about that person and that they also are remembering them. And so there's that connection, and that's so important.
Yeah, and that they mattered and they made a difference while they were here.
And if we go back to that ticker tape, that you described for us, the ticker tape's always playing. So they haven't forgotten. So say their name and engage with them into the ticker tape. Yeah. And we're going to have another episode about children, but I think memorialization is so important when we talk about children too, because sometimes children are not included in actual funerals or memorial services. And, as they maybe grow older, feel like maybe they didn't have a connection to that I think it's important to say it's never too late to have some type of ritual or memorialization and something that people can carry on. I had a teenager one time who just didn't really feel safe to grieve and mourn in the family. It was kind of, the message was, we're done. But she found her space by lighting a candle in the bathroom.
I remember having a client one time that on their loved one's special day, birthdays, anniversaries, holidays, whatever, they always wore green because that was her favorite color. And so nobody else knew it, but she knew that she was wearing that green for her loved one. And it's just those little things that you can do that don't have to involve anyone else and don't have to be big, showy type of ways of memorializing, even just little small things, carrying something in your pocket all the time. I carry a $2 bill that my dad had, and I carry it in my pocket every day and have for years. Just little reminders of those things.
And I've had people who've worn a special pin on their lapel, and it, gets other people to say, well, I like your pin. Where'd you get it? And that gives them the opportunity to tell their story. And I like that.
I think there's benefit in having those very personal, simple forms of memorialization, as well as, things that we, do as a group, which a lot of times happens, naturally, again, through memorial services and such. And a lot of times on significant days, I will suggest that to clients, have a personal form of memorialization, as well as something that maybe you include your family and friends in.
And we see that too. I think we have to talk about social media. That is a platform for people to memorialize their loved one and to share photos, or when the memories pop up, on those platforms, sharing that memory. And, I've had clients say, I don't want people to feel sorry for me when I post that, or I'm not trying to get attention. And, I always say, stop, you're not trying to get attention. You're sharing your grief. And that is a platform that allows for open expression. And that's what we want. And it's good for other people to see that too. They're reminded and they can join in with that shared grief.
Mm-hmm. Well, it gives them permission then to support you. If you put it out there,
right.
Then those people can support you.
Yeah, it makes it a little more comfortable for them to comment on it and talk about it with you.
So I think we have to remember that coping with the death of a loved one really has to become part of our new narrative. And that takes some time to wrap our heads around. We have to remember that we actively have to continue to make time for our grief, 3 years later, 5 years later, 8 years later, because that love does not stop, like we've said. So for me, some of these same things we've talked about, I always light a candle on special days, holidays, and I actively light it. And I don't necessarily include the rest of the family, but I actively light it and take a few minutes to think about my dad and my brother and my nephew and holidays with them and, things that maybe I miss about them being there at the holidays. And that candle stays lit all day. And that gives me comfort. Carol and I sometimes stick things in my pocket too, for special things. And so I think that's all very healthy. And healthy grief is grief that becomes part of the narrative. It's not healthy grief if it becomes all of the narrative or if it's shut out of the narrative. But healthy grief is grief that becomes part of our story into our future. And that takes time and expression and support to make that happen. For sure. So as we think about wrapping up, let's think about, kind of our listeners and with their grief, and just from all of our years of experience, what is maybe the one thing that we really want a grieving person to know?
I would just really like to reiterate something we've mentioned before, and that is that it is okay not to have everything figured out right away. As Carolyn said, so often we see our clients come in and they want to know the answer right away. They want to know how they're supposed to grieve and what's the right way, and just allowing themselves to have that trial and error and to figure it out and to know that it's a learning process, and with an emphasis on that word process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think also that they have to have hope, and that's a hard one. I think when you're grieving, especially early on, sometimes I think it's hard for people to see that. But I've been to San Francisco twice in my life. First time I went, I was at the Golden Gate Bridge, about to cross over. I could look up and see the bridge. I could see the cars in front of me. I saw the water and the boats below and the city and the woods in the distance from where we had just been. It was beautiful, one of those really clear, sunny, beautiful days. Second time I went, I was at that same spot, about to cross over that bridge, but that famous San Francisco fog you hear about had rolled in, and it had covered everything. And I could barely see the car behind me. I could not see the top of the bridge. Couldn't see the water, the boats, the city, the woods. I knew they were all there because I'd been there before, but it was very disorienting. And grief is kind of like that. It kind of rolls in like a fog that you see everything through or don't see everything through. And even though you know those things are there, like joy and meaning and love in life, because you've experienced them before, you know they're there, but it's hard to see them. And so sometimes we have to let someone else kind of hold on to that hope for us until we can see it ourselves. But, back to that first question you asked us of why we do this work. We couldn't do this work if we didn't see that, if we didn't see that hope, if we didn't see people in a different place. And I think that's what we see. And so I say that to say, if you don't feel that now, if you don't see that hope, know that for all those years that we've all talked about, we've been doing this work together, we've seen that.
Well, that's a great place to end. So thank you all. Thank you, Barbara and Carolyn and Lauren. I am truly so beyond honored to just know you, much less get to work with each of you. We talk about a lot what we know to be true. And we know that grief does heal. Grief can heal. So let me say that again. Grief can heal. However, grief demands a lot of attention and care, and grief needs support and patience. And really, I think what we've said here today is we want you to remember that your grief is a reflection of your love. And you are not alone. This world is full of grievers like you. We hope that today you have found some hope and that you can borrow some of our hope and hold on to us. You can also learn more about us at www.baptistgriefcenters.org. You can also check out our YouTube channel where we have a coping skills toolbox series that will be posted. And remember, grief is real, big, and better shared. We'll talk soon. Bye.
I'm Diane Brockmeyer, the CEO of Mid-America Transplant, and we are honored to sponsor this episode of Grief is Real, Big, Better Shared. At Mid-America Transplant, we have the privilege of working with families across southern Missouri and northeast Arkansas who choose to donate their loved ones' organs or tissues. While donation often brings families comfort, they are still heartbroken by their loss. We are proud to work with the Wilson Center for Good Grief and appreciate everything they are doing in the region to help bring healing to people who are coping with loss. Grief support is especially meaningful to me, as it was a tremendous help to my daughter, who lost her dad when she was 7 years old. 20 years later, she still recalls the positive, safe feelings she had with her grief support group. They understood her. Mid-America Transplant is inspired by life and by the donor families who give transplant patients a second chance. For more information about becoming a donor, visit sayyesgivelife.org.